This is Hidden Killers Week in Review.
A look back at the most prolific stories of the week.
This is continuing coverage of United States versus Sean Diddy Combs from the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today.
They offered him a deal, and he said, I ain't gonna take that. On May 1st, just days before jury selection, Sean Diddy Combs stood before a federal judge in Manhattan and made it crystal clear he is not going to take that deal. He's going to trial. The government had put a plea agreement on the table, terms that haven't been publicly disclosed but likely involved prison time in exchange for avoiding a full-blown spectacle in front of 12 jurors and the eyes of the world. And he turned it down, said he understood what was at stake, that he was ready to go forward. Of course, we are talking about the trial of Sean Diddy Combs, the United States against him for a lot of things. Sex trafficking being the big one of all of this, RICO charges as well. We'll get into all of it in just a moment, but how did we get here? What are we going to see? What can we expect? That's what this is all about. It's your pre-course to the trial of Sean Diddy Combs. Press subscribe wherever you're listening to this in the podcast world, or if you're watching this on YouTube, press subscribe there, and I'd love to see your comments in the comment section. If you're on the podcast platforms, do check out our podcast or our YouTube channel, Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski, and join us over there and let us know what you think. So we got a high-profile investigation that's now turned into a criminal trial with real consequences starting now. Jury selection has begun. Opening statements are set for May 12th. And unless something extraordinary happens, Sean Combs will soon be defending himself in federal court against charges that, if proven, could lock him away for life. Now, to understand how we got here and why that moment in the courtroom on May 1st matters so much, you've got to rewind, not decades, but just a couple of years, back to when everything started to shift from rumor over to reality. In November of 2023, his longtime ex-girlfriend, singer and model Cassie Ventura, filed a civil lawsuit that hit the industry like a grenade. It wasn't just salacious, it was structurally damning. She accused Combs of rape, physical abuse, and sex trafficking over the course of their long relationship. The details were chilling. Claims of being drugged, controlled, coerced, and even forced to perform sexual acts for his business associates. Within 24 hours of the lawsuit going public, it was settled out of court, but the fallout didn't end there. In fact, that may have been the match that lit the fuse, that created the explosion that now puts us where we are today. What followed was a deluge. More women came forward with lawsuits of their own. More allegations surfaced, some dating back 20 years. Former employees started talking, and then came the feds. In March of 24, Homeland Security and federal agents raided Combs' homes in Los Angeles and Miami. Not some knock-and-talk operation either. These were full-force raids, warrants in hand, tactical vests, agents going room to room. What they reportedly found became the foundation for the criminal case. Thousands of items, including hard drives, video footage, and for reasons we'll get into later, a stockpile of over 1,000 bottles of baby oil. Yeah, baby oil. If this sounds absurd, it is, but it also isn't a joke. Prosecutors saw it as part of a larger operation, one that allegedly involved the systematic exploitation of women under the guise of a glamorous, hedonistic lifestyle. 6 months later, in September of 24, Combs was arrested. No cameras, no red carpet, just a federal indictment in a quiet courtroom where he pled not guilty. The initial indictment listed 3 felony counts: racketeering, conspiracy, sex trafficking by force or coercion, and transportation for illegal sexual activity across state lines. Serious charges. Federal charges, the kind that don't just appear out of nowhere. From that point forward, the government built out its case like a construction project. In March of 25, they filed a superseding indictment, adding details, expanding timelines, and introducing allegations of forced labor. They claimed that Combs didn't just use people sexually, he used them in every conceivable way. Employees allegedly made to procure women, run errands that blurred the lines between logistics and coercion, and participate in maintaining a culture of silence where nothing was questioned and everything revolved around his needs. Then, just weeks before the trial, the prosecutors dropped their second superseding indictment, this time adding 2 brand new charges. Another count of sex trafficking and another count of interstate transport for unlawful sexual acts, both tied to a second alleged victim. And suddenly the case wasn't just about Cassie or one woman's account, it was about a pattern. When the prosecutors say spanned decades, involved multiple victims, and pointed to a deliberate, organized scheme. Combs' legal team didn't take this quietly. They argued the government was moving the goalposts late in the game. They asked the judge to throw out some of the new evidence, particularly the forced labor claims involving an employee. And in a pretrial win for the defense, Judge Aaron Submaranian agreed. That piece of the puzzle, those last-minute labor allegations, would not be shown to the jury. But when it came to the new sex trafficking charges and the second alleged victim story, that was a different story. The judge allowed it all in. The timeline got longer, the scope got wider, and the jury is going to hear about all of it. Then came another key decision, the question of whether jurors would be shown video footage of Combs in a 2016 altercation with Cassie Ventura caught on hotel surveillance. In that footage, now cleared for trial, Combs is seen chasing her down a hallway, grabbing her, throwing her to the floor, and kicking her. The defense argued that it was a private domestic dispute unrelated to the criminal enterprise at the heart of this case. But the judge ruled it was admissible. The prosecution says it speaks directly to the pattern of coercion and violence they intend to prove. The jury will decide what it all means. Other rulings in the lead-up to the trial went the government's way as well. The judge approved the use of pseudonyms for victims and witnesses, a move designed to protect their safety and encourage testimony. Combs' attorney pushed back, saying it would bias the jury, make it look like the witnesses had something to fear. But the court sided with the prosecutors. These were sensitive allegations, and witness protection came first because guess what? They do have something to fear because he has a history going after people that, don't necessarily go along his path of what he thinks is right. There was also a last-ditch move by the defense involving a potential psychiatric expert. And this is where it gets good. The defense floated the idea of presenting evidence that Combs may have had diminished capability due to drug use or mental health issues. Basically saying, he can't possibly be guilty of these charges. He's too high and drunk and mentally ill to be accountable. Let him go back to the parties. The government pounced immediately, filing a motion to block it, arguing that voluntary intoxication isn't a valid defense to the crimes he's accused of. The judge has yet to rule, but it's expected that any such argument will be severely limited, if not completely just thrown out. And through all of this, one thing hasn't changed. Combs is still in jail. He's been denied bail 3 times. The judge called him both a flight risk and a danger to the community, particularly to potential witnesses. The courts reviewed and rejected multiple bail proposals, including one where Combs offered $50 million and round-the-clock surveillance. The concern wasn't just that he might run, it was that he might reach out to the very people set to testify against him. At one point, prosecutors said Combs had used other inmates' phone pins to try and make untraceable calls from behind bars that didn't help his case at all. So he's staying put in federal custody until this trial plays out. And that brings us now to where we're at today. Jury selection starting. Hundreds of potential jurors have received summons. Yes, it's all about to begin. It's going to start with questions about bias, about familiarity with the case and attitudes towards sexual assault, power dynamics, and celebrity. The judge has approved an anonymous jury. Even the courtroom logistics, overflow rooms, press restrictions are already in place. What makes all of this so significant is not just the celebrity name attached to it. It's that we're watching a federal criminal case unfold in real time against someone who for decades seemed untouchable. The money, the fame, the empire, none of it insulated him from indictment. Now, none of it is going to shield him from a trial. Because right now, this very week, as we're putting this out there, the charges become evidence, the rumors become testimony, and the headlines become very real. And the courtroom becomes the only place where any of it truly matters. There's no such thing as a small federal indictment. But this one swings hard right out of the gate. Racketeering, sex trafficking, Mann Act violations. If you're picturing a celebrity scandal, forget it. What prosecutors have laid out in the criminal case against Sean Diddy Combs is something else entirely. A sweeping, multi-decade enterprise, they say, was built not on just music, money, or fame, but on control, on coercion, on fear. The federal indictment currently standing against Combs is made up of 5 felony charges filed by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. It spans roughly 20 years of alleged conduct touching on multiple victims, multiple locations, and multiple criminal statutes. And the language is not vague. According to the government, this wasn't a few bad nights or misunderstood relationships. It was a systematic operation with structure, planning, and criminal intent. At the core of the indictment is the RICO charge, short for Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act. It's the same federal law historically used to take down mob bosses, gang leaders, drug cartels, and R. Kelly. The idea behind RICO is this. If you run a business or organization and that operation exists either fully or in part to commit crimes, the enterprise itself becomes a criminal mechanism. And under that lens, even if each act alone might seem isolated, they're all legally connected. Prosecutors are arguing that Combs used his business, his brand, and his personal network as a kind of criminal infrastructure. According to the indictment, the enterprise in this case includes Combs' music companies, fashion labels, entertainment events, and even the teams of employees and associates who allegedly facilitated or concealed his behavior. They say this wasn't just about Combs acting alone. It was about a culture of compliance that kept everything operational. The language in the filing describes it as a pattern of racketeering activity, one that included not just sex trafficking, but also obstruction of justice, kidnapping, assault, and threats against witnesses. And if the jury buys into the RICO structure, it gives the prosecution enormous latitude. Every incident doesn't have to be criminal on its own. What matters is the pattern and the purpose behind it. Then there's the sex trafficking, 2 counts, both based on the same statute, Title 18, U.S. Code 1591. It's a law that criminalizes any commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or involving someone under the age of 18, though that part does not apply here. In Combs' case, the government alleges that he knowingly recruited and maintained control over 2 women, identified in court documents as Victim 1 and Victim 2, and forced them to engage in sexual activity against their will. The allegations are disturbing, even by the standards of other high-profile cases. Prosecutors say Combs orchestrated what he allegedly called freak-offs, elaborate, often days-long events that involved multiple sex partners, drug use, and physical and psychological coercion. These weren't private parties, they argue. They were designed, produced, staffed, and the government claims that Combs dictated the rules, selected the participants, and controlled the environment down to the lighting and the music. Women were allegedly told what to wear, what to do, and who to do it with, and were monitored the entire time. In filings, prosecutors say Combs used drugs, ketamine, ecstasy, cocaine, not just recreationally, but as tools of submission. They described victims being drugged, kept awake for extended periods, and given IV treatments afterward to recover. One woman reportedly passed out during an encounter and woke up to find herself being filmed. The implication is not subtle. Prosecutors believe Combs used these events to dominate and degrade and then record the acts as leverage. Multiple victims allege he later used footage to threaten exposure if they ever spoke out. And they weren't the only ones under pressure. Witnesses in the case, both victims and staff, have claimed they were manipulated, bribed, or outright threatened into staying silent. Prosecutors say there were instances of arson, including the destruction of a car allegedly tied to an associate who crossed Combs. They also reference kidnapping, victims allegedly confined to rooms, their phones taken, physically preventing from leaving. Whether or not the jury agrees those indictments meet the legal threshold for racketeering or trafficking, they are part of the broader story the government is telling. A man who used fear and force to get what he wanted and power to erase the consequences. The government's evidence isn't limited to testimony. It includes the now widely discussed surveillance footage from the 2016 hotel encounter with Cassie Ventura, where Combs is seen on camera chasing her, grabbing her, kicking her, and beating her as she fell to the ground. The defense argued this incident was a personal dispute, irrelevant to the charges, but the judge disagreed, allowing it into trial as evidence of coercive behavior, particularly since prosecutors allege the altercation happened during a freak-off weekend. During their 2024 raids on Combs' residence, agents reportedly seized hard drives, computers, and external media that prosecutors believe contains recordings and digital communications relevant to the case. They also recovered large quantities of sexual paraphernalia, items which the government has framed not as salacious but functional tools. Tools, in their words, used to sustain a pattern of sexual domination. It's not about kink. It is about control with Diddy. The Mann Act charges round out the indictment. These stem from Combs allegedly transporting women across state lines to engage in illegal sexual activity. The law, which dates back to 1910, is often used in modern trafficking cases where interstate travel is involved. Prosecutors argue that Combs flew or otherwise arranged travel for victims to attend freak-offs or other events under false pretenses, promising luxury, opportunity, or intimacy, and then subjecting them to coercive sexual acts. It's one of the quieter charges in terms of attention, but one that could carry significant weight because, unlike the more subjective question of whether someone was coerced, crossing a state line with criminal intent is much easier to prove if the logistics, plane tickets, hotel receipts, texts are documented. And they are. The government's witness list has not been made public in full yet, but filings and prior hearings suggest it will include not only the two primary victims, but also former staff members, drivers, assistants, and perhaps even medical professionals connected to the aftermath of these events. Witnesses may testify under pseudonyms, a measure the court has approved to protect their safety. The goal, prosecutors say, is to present a complete picture, not just of isolated incidents, but of a repeated structure, a cycle. The structure is what makes the RICO charge so crucial to the government's case. If the jury accepts that there was a functioning criminal enterprise, meaning an organization through which Combs routinely committed or facilitated crimes, then each act fits into that larger pattern. The sex trafficking becomes not just abuse, but a feature of the operation. The threats, the recordings, the travel, all of it, arrangements, the payoffs. They all reinforce the idea that this wasn't chaos, it was, in fact, design. And that's the case prosecutors will present in federal court. Not that Sean Combs is guilty of being rich, famous, indulgent, or morally questionable, but that he used his power to build and run something resembling a private system of exploitation, one that lasted for decades, one that is finally being brought into the public light. Of course, that's only one side of the courtroom. The other side, the defense, isn't sitting silent. They've already laid the groundwork for their argument. That's what the government calls, what the government calls coercion was, in fact, consent, according to them, that these weren't victims, but partners. that there was no enterprise, only lifestyle. And what happened behind closed doors was private, not criminal. If you strip down the most basic courtroom choreography, the government's job is to prove the defense's job and to poke holes. Sean Combs' legal team has made it clear. They intend to turn every accusation into a question mark. This isn't about denying the lifestyle. It's about denying the criminality of it. Because from day one, Combs' lawyers haven't pretended their client was some monk in the monastery. What they're saying is that sex parties, drugs, even aggression, none of it equals trafficking, and none of it makes it criminal. Combs has pled not guilty to all 5 felony counts, no plea deals, no admissions, just the straight position that what the government is calling exploitation was in fact a series of consensual adult relationships fueled by fame, money, and mutual indulgence. Mark Agnifilo, the high-profile defense attorney leading the charge, has leaned into this narrative publicly and in court. Yes, Combs lived large. Yes, he engaged in what many people would call extreme behavior, but according to the defense, it wasn't forced, it wasn't criminal, it was lifestyle, just not one everybody understands. That argument runs through everything the defense has said and done leading up to the trial. From their filings to their media posture, the strategy is clear. Recast the image of Combs not as a predator, but as a libertine, a man with particular taste, sure, but not a man running a criminal enterprise. And definitely not a man deserving life in prison. Let's start with the language they've used. In multiple public statements, the defense has referred to Combs as a swinger and described his sexual behavior as consensual, albeit unconventional. They've acknowledged long-term relationships with some of the women now testifying against him, and they've emphasized the length and intimacy of those relationships as proof that these weren't hit-and-run assaults. One defense memo even stated flatly that some of the women involved had benefited financially, professionally, and socially from being in Combs' orbit. The implication being this wasn't exploitation, it was mutually beneficial. Now, to be clear, the defense isn't denying that emotions ran high or that there were fights or even that things sometimes got out of control. Yeah. Plenty of couples have dramatic relationships. They argue without being dragged into federal court. The defense's job is to make the jury see those moments, however ugly, as personal, not prosecutable. One of the main weapons in their arsenal is attacking the credibility and motives of the accusers. Combs' team has pointed out that many of the women coming forward have also filed civil lawsuits or sought monetary settlements. They've suggested that these civil actions are not only financially motivated, but also coordinated to apply pressure. After the Cassie case settled quickly in 2023, a wave of similar lawsuits followed. The defense sees that as a pattern, not of victimization, but of opportunism. And it's not just about the money. The defense has also flagged what they consider inconsistencies in the accuser's behaviors. They pointed out that some women maintained contact with Combs for years after the alleged abuse, that others sent affectionate messages, and that several stayed in romantic or professional relationships with him long after the events. In legal terms, these aren't necessarily disqualifying, but the defense knows that for a jury, they muddy the waters. If someone claims coercion but also appears on red carpets or in vacation photos with the alleged abuser, that creates room for doubt. And doubt is the only friend a defense attorney really needs. Then there's the big structural challenge, the RICO charge. Combs' lawyers are attacking it from both ends. First, they're arguing that his company's Bad Boy Entertainment, Sean John, Combs Wines and Spirits are legitimate, profit-driven businesses, not fronts for criminal activity. There's no evidence, they claim, that these entities were created or used to traffic women or cover up crimes. If anything, they argue these are the vehicles of a successful entrepreneur who's made millions through music, fashion, and branding. Second, they're disputing the very idea of an enterprise. According to the defense, this wasn't some organized criminal ring. There were no coordinated plans between employees to lure, drug, or abuse women. If things happened at parties or behind closed doors, they argue, those things were between Combs and the people involved, not part of a larger scheme. The notion that his assistants or bodyguards or label staff were somehow co-conspirators in a long-running trafficking operation is, in their words, absurd. If the prosecution is trying to frame excess as structure, the defense is trying to yank that structure apart. And that brings us to the courtroom tactics. Combs' team has fought hard to exclude key pieces of evidence, most notably the surveillance footage of the 2016 altercation between Combs and Cassie. That video, now widely reported on, shows Combs grabbing, throwing, and kicking Ventura in a hotel hallway. His lawyers call it highly prejudicial, arguing that it doesn't prove trafficking, that it's unrelated to the charges, and that it could poison the jury emotionally. The judge disagreed. The footage is in, but the defense is already positioning it as a regrettable moment in a bad relationship, not a reflection of Combs' overall conduct, and certainly not proof of a sex trafficking operation. Another point of contention has been the use of pseudonyms for some witnesses. The prosecution requested for the court, and the court granted permission for certain accusers to testify without using their full names, citing safety concerns. The defense pushed back on that, claiming this could unfairly suggest that Combs is dangerous or that the women are in hiding. The court ruled in the government's favor, but it's another example of how the defense is watching every detail, trying to keep the jury from being swayed by anything that feels theatrical or weighed against them. And then there's a curveball, the possibility of a psychiatric defense. In late April, Combs' team filed notice that they might call a mental health expert, likely to testify that Combs was under the influence of drugs or suffering from some form of psychological impairment that affected his judgment. Prosecutors immediately filed a motion to block that line of defense, arguing that voluntary intoxication is not a legal excuse for trafficking or coercion. As of now, the judge hasn't ruled definitively on whether that expert testimony will be allowed, but it signals that the defense may be laying groundwork to argue not just he didn't do it, but also he wasn't thinking clearly if he did. It's a risky strategy because it walks a fine line. On one hand, it suggests diminished intent, a kind of mental fog that complicates accountability. On the other hand, it opens the door to questions about whether Combs was in control of his behavior at all, which could undermine the core of their own consensual and controlled narrative. Still, in this high-stakes trial, every option stays on the table until the court says otherwise. Throughout all of this, the message to the jury will be tightly focused. Don't confuse controversy with crime. Don't turn a lifestyle into a legal violation. Don't let shock value become proof. The defense wants jurors to see Combs not as a monster, but as a man whose personal life doesn't fit social norms. Someone who liked things excessive, sure, but who had consenting adults around him who liked it that way too. Someone who might have crossed lines emotionally, maybe even morally, but who never crossed it into criminality. That message is going to be hit over and over again, from opening statements to closing arguments, because when it's all said and done, Combs doesn't have to prove anything. He just has to raise enough doubt to make a conviction impossible. That's the defense's playbook, and that's what they're bringing into the courtroom. And now it's up to the jury to decide whether they're buying it. Are you buying it? Tell me in the comments what's your thoughts on this case. Press subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast, and whatever platform, and also check out our YouTube channel if you're already there. Thank you. Press or go into the comments section and let us know what you think about this case and the many cases that we cover here with the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. Press subscribe as well. My name is Tony Brueski. Thank you for joining us. We will talk again real soon.
Craving non-stop true crime updates? Press subscribe now and get the latest cases, analysis, and expert commentary delivered straight to your feed, only from the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. In a world where the darkest secrets lie just beneath the surface.
They said it was an accident, but the evidence says otherwise.
Where hidden killers roam, unnoticed, in the shadows.
I think you would definitely be looking at a blend of toxic, very bad narcissistic personality traits, and they will be vengeful and possibly resort to violence.
Join Tony Brueski as he uncovers the truth behind the most chilling cases.
They said it was an accident, but the evidence clearly says otherwise.
Each episode, we dig deep into the minds of those who commit the unthinkable.
To your point on narcissism, he thinks in his own mind how witty he is.
Yeah.
But he lost that jury. I was done with him in 2 minutes.
From unsolved mysteries to infamous crimes.
Geez, you've just talked about how you've taught yourself how to do everything under the sun. I bet you did a YouTube video, how to best kill somebody with a knife.
Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski takes you where few dare to go.
How does someone with such a dark secret go unnoticed for so long?
With multiple new episodes every single day.
We're not just telling stories, we're seeking justice.
Listen now on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski.